Barrister Michael Charleswood from 20 Essex Chambers will moderate this session. Barrister Wood, please take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, and may I say what a great pleasure it is to be here in Korea. I'd like to congratulate and thank all those who've organized this international conference on the law of the sea for the excellent arrangements, and for those of us who are able to be here in Incheon for their very kind hospitality. Before I turn to the second session, I'd like to come back quickly to the references that were made earlier about the United Kingdom parliamentary inquiry into UNCLOS. UNCLOS, is it fit for purpose, is the title given to the inquiry. I think personally that it's very clear that it is fit for purpose. The discussions in the House of Lords Committee have been very interesting, as was said. They can be watched online, but also there are some very interesting written submissions which I would recommend, which are not yet, at least when I last looked, were not yet online, but there are written submissions by Judge David Anderson, by Professor Robin Churchill, by others, by myself, and most of those say very clearly that UNCLOS is fit for purpose, that it's not sensible to think of renegotiating it, though of course it can be interpreted subject to Judge Kolodkin's very wise words of caution, and it can be supplemented with new instruments as necessary. Now, welcome everyone to the second session, the subject of which is the role of scientific assessment in the law of the sea. This raises very important and contemporary issues for the law of the sea generally, including also for litigation between international and domestic courts. And Judge Pike stressed the importance of these matters in his keynote address and has already touched on some of the questions to be dealt with in this panel. The panelists will address three very different aspects of scientific assessment. They'll each speak for 20 minutes, please, and there'll be one discussant, so that we should be able to save 10 minutes and finish on time at 8:20, which is my intention. So the first speaker is Professor Warwick GULLETT, who joins us online. He will speak about the contribution of the precautionary principle to the protection of the marine environment. The precautionary principle, or prudence and caution, as our friends at ICLS sometimes call it, appears to be central to the law of the sea on the environment, and I'm sure Professor GULLETT will explain just how central or not it is. As you know from the pamphlet about the conference, Professor GULLETT is Professor of Law at the University of Wollongong in New South Wales, Australia. He's written a good deal about the law of the sea, specifically about the protection of the environment and on fisheries, and also about ICLOS and maritime delimitation. So without more ado, I'll invite Professor GULLETT to address us. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for the introduction. 안녕하세요. I've shared my screen. It looks like that is working well. I'd like to thank the organisers for their invitation to be part of this series. It's a delight to be asked. I only wish I was able to travel to Incheon to be with you as well, but alas, I'm coming in from Australia. So my talk is looking at the precautionary principle and how it has fared in marine environmental protection over the last 30 years. So what I've turned my mind to is the question about Is this a good time to reflect about the precautionary principle after it leaping onto the international stage 30 years ago, around 1992 with the Rio Declaration, and it emerged in the key area of the marine environment. And it's worth reflecting to see, has it lived up to its expectations? And in particular, what I'm interested in is the debate that occurred in the mid 1990s, where there was an incredible amount of debate about the precautionary principle, with a lot of people strong advocates for it, but also there were alarmist critics. And it's will be, to my mind, it's interesting to see, has it been effective in helping to protect the marine environment. So that's a framework for this talk. So first, what is the precautionary principle? What is the background context? So there are various phraseology for the precautionary principle. I'll turn to some more specific ones in a moment. And in particular, what I'm interested in, has it emerged as a strong principle that is the foundation for most decisions dealing with the protection of our marine environment and how the marine resources are used. So essentially, as I think we'd all know, the precautionary principle is trying to address environmental uncertainty, providing a basis to take firm decisions, even though we might be in a situation where we don't have full knowledge about the environmental consequences of particular activities. So how can we battle through a situation of uncertainty but still make prudent decisions? So when it leapt onto the international stage in 1992, it received a lot of criticisms, very fierce criticisms, essentially that it challenged existing legal order. It did things such as abandon science as a basis for rational decision making. So rather than say what was quite common in developing countries where there was quite advanced environmental law, that you could have developments that could cause harm to the environment, they were only stopped or moderated if there was if it's reached a point where it's known that it was causing significant environmental harm. That sort of level of proof that was necessary. The precautionary principle can be seen as flipping things around, where you need to have a certain level of confidence before you can engage in an activity that might cause environmental harm. So the role of science is critical to understanding how the precautionary principle is to be used. But of course, there's also debate about when the precautionary principle is triggered, what level of concern is necessary before we start invoking the principle, and then when it is triggered, well, what does it lead to? And there can be a range of precautionary responses to a particular concern. And this leads to perhaps, I think, the criticism that cuts through the most of the principle, that it can lead to arbitrary decision making, where there's no scientific or proper basis for making a decision to bring in strict precautionary measures. So I think for the advocates of the principle, we must always be keeping an eye on how it can be used and is there a logical basis for invoking it, rather than any type of concern about environmental harm. So the principle was adopted internationally at staggering speed. So from the early to mid 1990s, it appeared in just about every international marine environmental treaty we can think of, and it was appearing in domestic legislation rapidly. It's also developed in other fields other than marine protection into some other areas such as chemical regulation and so on. So what is of interest to me is that really fierce debate in the 1990s. We don't see it anymore. So does that mean that the precautionary principle was not as bad as its critics said? Or does it mean that it's basically been accepted, but it hasn't been used with a lot of zeal and enthusiasm by regulators? Maybe they've just paid lip service to it. So what sort of explains this sort of lack of, the absence of the fierce debate these days? So in the 1990s, a massive amount of literature developed. I started looking at this in the mid 1990s as a PhD student, and I can actually say I read every piece of literature that dealt with precautionary principle and law in those days. But it was barely 10. Now it's impossible to count, and the literature has sprawled out into other fields and other sectors. Much of the literature has fully canvassed many issues, such as whether the principle has crystallized into a principle of customary international law, how it actually reverses the burden of proof, its relationship with science, and what's seen as largely a semantic difference between precautionary principle and precautionary approach. And it's brought out to other areas. There's debate about whether Europe or the US is more precautionary, and it's raised concerns in international investment law, such as whether a host state could be liable for indirect expropriation for a new environmental measure based on the precautionary principle that has the effect of devaluing a foreign investment. But nonetheless, the current literature doesn't really challenge the fundamental underpinnings of the principle. Now, one of the key, I wouldn't say architect, but one of the great proponents and contributors to the development of the precautionary principle is Professor David Freestone, and he wrote very early on that the precautionary principle was adopted before it was understood, meaning it was rapidly adopted in international instruments without there being at the same time clear guidance emerging about how it can be operationalized in relevant decisions made under the different legal instruments. So even though we could say the general idea behind the precautionary principle is understood, a step-by-step guide for implementation was not available. So the early, the origins of the principle are well understood as being German and Swedish, and particularly around the North Sea being the first area for formal adoption at the international level. But if we're looking for precautionary thinking, well, that predates these early adoptions. We can see it in the 1982 World Charter for Nature. We can look at with some of the principles in the 1972 Stockholm Declaration, and also in national environmental law. And I think one of the key things we can look at is the first legislative EIA process, the US NEPA Act from 1969. And our next speaker, Professor Craik, is taking us to the key area of EIA. But we can also say the precautionary principle didn't just radically appear. It appeared as part of following the process of enlightened environmental thought through the 1970s, where a lot of ecologists were theorizing about how we're going to take a different approach to environmental regulation. So it's got a sort of a sound of more solid underpinning than when it suddenly appeared in 1992. So what does it mean? Well, what I've got here is the definition that's most commonly cited. That's from 1992 in the Rio Declaration. So first off, this is not the only formulation of the principle, but it's the most widely adopted and cited. And I think some of the present problems we have come from this definition. So let's have a brief look at it. Where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage. So immediately we're setting quite a high level of scientific proof being necessary before we're triggering the precautionary principle, a threat of serious or irreversible damage. If that's the case, then what? Well, if there's a lack of scientific certainty, don't use that as an excuse for postponing cost-effective measures. You could find another excuse. So it's not really setting a high standard. And if we pull this apart, it really looks more like prevention than it does precaution. And Australia was an early adopter in legislation of the precautionary principle with almost identical formulation to this. So Australia, we're a strong adopter of the principle, but to my mind, it's quite a weak and unhelpful version, and it's got triple negative phraseology. But if we're looking for the least specific definition of the principle, I think we can go to Professor Neil Craik's country, our friends in Canada, and the Oceans Act. It's defined as erring on the side of caution. It sounds nice, but that's not really a precise standard. There is certainly the option for more specificity in domestic law than trying to get specific standards set in international law. And I think we can say that there's ample evidence in the marine context of precautionary principles being used, but it's still hard to discern its contours because it can blend into other decision-making norms as well. So let's just look briefly at two areas in the marine environment. Marine pollution, which is really what triggered the precautionary principle in the first place. And obviously the principle resonates with this topic. The whole idea that if there's going to be emission of pollutants into the marine environment, well, if they keep on accumulating or they're particularly hazardous, well, that's going to cause harm to the environment. So rather than accepting the assimilation principle that the ocean is vast and capable of coping with all pollutants that are emitted, the precautionary principle is stepping in and saying we need to have much greater confidence before we are emitting pollutants into the sea, and some pollutants should be prohibited. So this is really what kicked off the precautionary principle, and in some areas it's in a legal form which has positive obligations, and some strong versions, including having reverse listing of substances. Now, part of the early debate was generated to a degree by an early strong version of the principle in the Oslo Declaration that was seen to be unworkable. And I've got it here on the slide. This was saying, dumping of industrial waste in the North Sea shall cease unless there's no alternative on land. That's fine. And the materials will cause no harm to the marine environment. Now, this is very difficult. You could argue it's logically impossible to prove a negative proposition that there will be no harm. Try to think how many scientific studies will need to be done for a particular pollutant to reach a definitive conclusion that it causes no harm to the environment. Think about how it can be replicated, how the studies are being done to provide that positive proof. So this was seen to be too strict, and the precautionary principle going mad. That was later ameliorated, but still dealing with marine pollution is still one of the strongest versions that we have of the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle obviously is also suited to fisheries, where we are trying to harvest different species on a sustainable basis indefinitely. And there's great uncertainty in fishing, the impact of fishing, different fishing gear on species, how much quota should be permitted, the impact on taking targeted species on predator and prey species, and so on. Uncertainty abounds in the fisheries context. And the application of the precautionary principle, I think, can lead to perplexing responses. So potentially, to my mind, you could have a decision that on the face of it is more harmful because it's allowing increasing quota for a target species. But to my mind, that could occur backed up by the precautionary principle if there's been a solid rational basis prior to that decision being made, such as having detailed studies, including on predator and prey species, non-target species, could lead to a conclusion that a fishery could have a greater quota, and there's a higher level of confidence that would be satisfactory. So we do have a range of precautionary responses that could occur. The principle has been used extensively in fisheries. I think the number one document that's adopted it is the UN Fish Stocks Agreement, which has many hundreds of words with more specific detail about how to operationalize the precautionary approach, including doing things like having studies of non-target species, doing things like having predetermined reference points if stock numbers or certain measures are reached. Then we know straight away a regulatory measure will be introduced, rather than waiting for a problem, it occurs, and then trying to work out what to do. Some of these decisions can be worked out beforehand when predetermined reference points are met. So I'll turn now briefly to Australian fisheries law, which I think is one of the superstars, in a sense, of the precautionary principle, due to a bit of a quirk in how it has been adopted in legislation. And we can say at the federal level in Australia, the precautionary principle has been well and truly adopted, and it goes all the way through the culture of the main federal fisheries agency. And that, I would argue, comes down to how it's included in the legislation. So the actual substantive provision has the same definition, almost identical to the Rio Declaration, so it's quite weak. But we don't just need to know what the definition of the precautionary principle is, it's what the legal standard set with regard to it is. And here, the standard that has been in Australian fisheries legislation since 1997 is that the objective that includes the precautionary principle must be pursued. Typically, legislation like this would have a standard: these principles must be considered or taken into account. This formulation says must be pursued, and that is actually a higher standard than simply considering and perhaps then disregarding the use of the precautionary principle. So the fact that that phrase is there has put more of a positive duty on the federal fisheries agency, We don't have that at the subnational level at the state fisheries agencies. So this has led to the situation, rather than having a case where there's been a lot of environmental law cases taken against agencies by environmentalists arguing that the particular environmental regulatory agency was not precautionary enough. In Australia, the case law has been taken by fishers arguing that the Fisheries Management Agency was taking decisions that were too precautionary. So it's flipped the other way. And in each case, those challenges were unsuccessful. But we can also put Australia's version next to the New Zealand version, which actually does not mention the word precaution, but actually has more detail about what it means to make precautionary decisions. It fleshes out a little bit of the content, such as basing decisions on the best available information, explicitly considering uncertainty. So these are positive obligations that must be demonstrated by the fisheries regulators in New Zealand that can lead, I think, leads to more precautionary decisions than legislation that might adopt the principle without detail about how to go about implementing it. So briefly, I'll look at an aberration in Australian fisheries law from 2012. So this is a case where there was great concern about the potential use of the world's second largest fishing vessel, a massive fishing factory vessel. So a company in Australia had already been approved to fish for a target species and had an allocated quota, had various regulations of how to minimise bycatch and so on. And then subsequently, it wished to change the vessel that it was permitted to use into this larger vessel to fish exactly in the same manner, but in a more efficient way, because it won't have to come into port so often. And there was enormous controversy throughout Australia about this being a terrible result, leading to large vessels. So there was a rushed legislative amendment to empower the stopping of this vessel. So a declaration could be made if the Environment and Fisheries Ministers agreed that there is uncertainty about environmental impact of an activity. That was declared on one day, a regulation was issued the next day to apply to this vessel to stop it. And this is where I think this led to a conclusion that was politically acceptable to stop the vessel, but it creates a situation where there's almost no stopping the use of the precautionary principle, because the regulator can say, well, there's uncertainty. And there's uncertainty with any aspect I think we look at when we talk about marine fisheries. So having a legislative base like this, I think is inappropriate. So my conclusions are that the precautionary principle has, in the marine environment context, become a bedrock principle. I don't think it's really being challenged. The main issue is whether it's being used effectively or whether it's just being given lip service. I think we can point to precautionary thinking being a solid basis underpinning a lot of developments in marine environmental protection across different fields, such as how ballast water is dealt with, particularly sensitive sea areas being adopted. The precautionary principle, I think, helps create those type of initiatives. I still think a key issue will be how to flesh out the principle more in the legal documents that are adopted to guide decision makers to consistent and repeatable decisions. And this is my final slide. So we have a situation where the precautionary principle is largely accepted, but in some fields it's not being used with great force, and some areas it's actually missing. So, for example, I looked at recently Bangladesh fisheries law. There's no mention of the precautionary principle. In the UK, it looked like we lost the precautionary principle because that was in the EU instruments, and then we had Brexit. But happily, as of just a week or so ago, it's back into UK law in their Environment Act. Although there's no real detail about how it's to be used, it's still fairly opaque there. So what I'd like to see, I'll finish up now, what I'd like to see is environmental regimes that are interested, that see the principles being relevant to their tasks, the regulators be given more guidance in their instruments about how they can give effect to it and to withstand challenges. Okay, thank you. I'll pass on back to our chair.
Well, thank you very, very much, Professor Gullett. I feel I've learnt more about the precautionary principle in the last 20 minutes than I've ever known about it before. I feel I begin to understand it better.